Welcome back again, my lords, ladies, and lieges, to another episode of Zodiac Reads, the series where Zodiac finds things to read on the internet and then, well, he reads them for you. Today we are back again on r/RPG horror stories, but with a bit of a twist this time. You see, this episode is the beginning of a 3-part series of stories all written by the same user. Now, while these stories aren't intimately linked together, I thought it would be interesting to read them in chronological order. You're at the starting point now, so no other videos to check out, but I would insist you join me and follow the next 2 episodes. I find that this author has a very fun writing style, and I think you will enjoy this series with me. The last thing I will warn you, however, is that this story is rated not safe for work. While the author does not go into graphic detail about anything, do understand there are some inappropriate details mentioned in this story, especially towards the end. So if mentionings of possibly sexual content make you uncomfortable, perhaps give this story a pass. I will understand. But without further ado, let's get on to the story. Player becomes infatuated with my NPC, demands I ERP with her, not graphic, but marking it not safe for work just in case, by RedHotOwl. I'll start off by giving you all some context. I've always been interested in the storytelling aspects of RPGs. However, I hadn't had the greatest of experiences when trying to get it into traditional TTRPGs like D&D and the like. Stories for another time, this is long enough as it is. So, around 7 to 8 years ago, while I was still in high school, some friends I had met through World of Warcraft suggested that I could GM, if you could even call it that, a sort of choose-your-own-adventure style session for them that was primarily focused on plot and RP. The actual mechanics were very simplistic and pretty much only there to settle the occasional dispute. Since the purpose of the whole setting was a sort of collaborative writing adventure where the main focus was to tell a story with me acting as the story's narrator. To this day, I'm not sure whether they came up with the concept on their own or if this style of play has an official name. They literally just called it a narrative RPG. I'm sure the more experienced among you can tell me whether that's a thing or not. I've never been much of an RPer, but I am, I'd like to think, a passable writer, especially considering that English isn't my first language. So, in spite of my reluctance, I eventually agreed to create a narrative for all their characters. Given the rules-light nature of the game, a lot of the restrictions had to be enforced by the lore and just general common sense. But I rarely had anyone going into business for themselves, since doing so would have been counterintuitive to everyone's enjoyment. There were ways to get your character killed if you really wanted to, sure, but I had no incentive to deliberately stifle anyone, nor did the players have any reason to go out of their way to pick fights they couldn't win. Overall, it was a surprisingly fun time and gave me a chance to flex my creative muscles. I started putting more and more effort into the world, crafting stories and adventures my players could choose to partake in, with different outcomes depending on their actions or inactions. That is, until a player I'll just refer to as Jane came along. Jane started as a new and pretty active member of the World of Warcraft guild my friends and I were a part of. She and one of said friends, henceforth referred to as Loverboyxxx because he will read this and I'm feeling petty, had apparently grown close and were all up in each other's DMs. Nothing wrong with that. At some point, he had even told her about our group's weekly online sessions and invited her to join. I was officially introduced to Jane via voice chat and I gave her a rundown of the setting, the current campaign's progress, and the general guidelines for designing her character. She seemed pretty receptive to it all and was eager to join in on the party's adventures, even going the extra mile by making her first character my world's equivalent of a healer so that the party, who were a tight-knit band of former cutthroats, had an incentive to bring her along. It created an interesting dynamic where Jane's sheltered character grew accustomed to the world at the same rate she did, bringing some much-needed contrast to the party's composition. If I absolutely had to nitpick, I'd say that she liked playing the role of the damsel in distress a bit too often for my liking, but no one else seemed to mind, so I refrained from commenting on it at the time. Without going into too much detail, the setting was a blend between traditional fantasy, Egyptian mythology, and Turkish folklore, where the party often had to leave the safety of the capital and venture into the untamed desert in search for long-forgotten tombs, treasures, and the like. Following the party's decision to side with the guards during an uprising, they were invited to the palace, where they were to meet and be congratulated by the royal family themselves for playing a pivotal role in subduing the rebellion. Pleasantries were exchanged, and meaningless titles were granted before the party were sent off back to the base in the slums. If that sounds underwhelming, it's because that was the point. I was trying to establish how detached the nobles were from the plight of their subjects. Despite all my efforts to write them as condescending dicks, one of the members of the royal family, who I'll just refer to as the prince for simplicity's sake, seemed to have left an impression on Jane's character. To clarify, the prince was the youngest of the king's sons and the embodiment of narcissism. I wrote him to be as douchey and elitist as possible, which made the Hewer's sudden crush on him all the more baffling. Yes, I described him as being very physically attractive, but that was literally his only redeeming quality. And there was no shortage of traditionally attractive NPCs and player characters surrounding her constantly if she really wanted to go down that route. That said, Jane's character was meant to be naive, so I figured her swooning over a guy that despises everything she represents could have been used to highlight her inexperience. Unfortunately, it was nothing as self-aware as that. Both in character and out, Jane kept bringing the prince up, much to the rest of the party's annoyance. She insisted that they fully align themselves with the crown in hopes of earning more favor, while simultaneously asking me when they were going to be meeting him again. As you can probably guess, Loverboyxxx was particularly and quite vocally against this for obvious reasons. Perhaps I should have been more stern in railroading them away from that entire plotline, but in my defense, I was really committed to adapting to everyone's choices. Jane got her way eventually, dragging everyone along with her and forcing me to come up with more and more stuff that they could do for the local gentry. I made a point of clearly telling them that their efforts were appreciated, but it wasn't getting them any closer to another audience with the prince. Keep in mind that this was an NPC. I hadn't even put much thought into it at the time, since I never expected him to be anything beyond an entitled prick whose entire purpose was to symbolize the blatant disconnect between the common man and the ruling class. I could have, and eventually did, flesh him out more, but at the time, nobody apart from Jane cared enough about him to justify doing that. Loverboyxxx was getting pretty fed up by Jane's infatuation with my NPC, and out of character demanded that we move on to something else. I explained that I had been presenting them with different plot hooks this entire time, but instead they just keep catering to her healer's whims, who had pretty much assumed somewhat of a de facto leader role. If nothing else, the mental image of a ragtag group of hardened outlaws following around a teenage girl pursuing her crush was sort of amusing. Finally picking up on the group's frustrations, Jane relented and we were allowed to move on to something else. It was at this point when Loverboyxxx's character started trying to get closer to Jane's, which, while awkward at times, at least made sense since they had a thing IRL. Both of their characters were of similar age and it didn't interfere with my storytelling. Jane was open-minded to the idea, but didn't seem particularly excited about it. Her healer and his cutthroat continued with their in-character flirting throughout several campaigns, but their relationship never evolved past the occasional innuendo or remark. All was well until that fateful evening, when I saw that Jane had messaged me several times on Skype. When I opened our conversation, I saw paragraph upon paragraph of her, I'm assuming in character, since most of it was surrounded by quotation marks, proclaiming her love for the prince and straight up demanding to meet him again. It's been a long time, so I don't remember exactly what she said, but I distinctly remember her threatening to leave the friend group altogether if I didn't make it happen. She went on to guilt-trip me by saying that it would have been my fault if Loverboyxxx, I kid you not, killed himself over her leaving without a word, since she was apparently helping him battle through some mental illness none of us were aware of? What the fuck? I honestly had no idea how to react. I remember just sitting there, reading through her messages and trying to formulate some sort of adequate reply in my head. Eventually, I settled on the worst thing I could have probably done. I proposed to narrate a private, non-canon exchange between her healer and my NPC. Obviously, she agreed and was pretty enthusiastic about it, as though she hadn't just threatened my friend's mental health in order to get her way. I have no excuse for choosing to indulge her instead of immediately talking to Loverboyxxx about the whole thing. I guess I was both worried about him and scared of our friend group disbanding, which eventually happened anyway, but over an unrelated incident. Fast forward to the day of my private session with Jane. The scene opened with the prince standing on a balcony overlooking the royal gardens and her character being invited into his quarters. I obviously knew what she was after, so I made up some bullshit reason as to why he had taken a sudden interest in her. I don't remember what it was exactly. Both expressed their inexplicable infatuation with each other, and things obviously got heated. So I hurried to fade to black, only Jane wasn't having it. She was basically expecting me to ERP with her, something I had never done and had no interest in doing. I explained to her that, at the time, I wasn't really interested in exploring sexual stuff, both in and out of character. Cue the porn. That's right, folks. Jane seemed to have thought that all I needed was some inspiration, and so in her infinite wisdom, proceeded spamming me pictures and gifs of explicit acts she wanted my character to do to hers. Then she went on to make the whole thing feel 10 times weirder by expressing how this sort of content was making her feel. Though both of us were 18 at the time, I still don't feel comfortable recounting her exact words verbatim. Let's just say that she was making me increasingly uncomfortable, until she left me no choice but to tell her off, which she took as well as you'd expect. She left the group soon after and blocked all of us, including Loverboyxxx, who took it hard, but got over it after confiding in the rest of us instead. Not sure what Jane has been up to since. I had seen her mentioned in passing a few times before our World of Warcraft guild got disbanded for good, since most of us moved on to other games and hobbies. Apparently, she is currently married, so I genuinely wish her all the best, and hope that she has grown as a person and since the above-mentioned incident. Only recently did me and Loverboyxxx reconnect, who you can thank for reminding me about Jane and directing me to this subreddit. It's a mildly uncomfortable experience at best compared to the other stories I've read on here, but I thought it might still be worth sharing. Edit. Just to be clear, I'm not implying my friend did anything wrong in this scenario. The ridiculous name I've given him is just a harmless in-joke between us that I like teasing him about. If I had a nickel for every time someone's tried to start an ERP with somebody, the other person expressed they were uncomfortable, and their solution was to send them porn, I would have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but it's weird it's happened twice. Jokes aside, I don't think this needs to be said, but in case it does, don't do this. It doesn't matter whether the situation is fictional or real. It doesn't matter what genders are involved in the situation. It doesn't matter whether it's roleplay or physical interaction. Don't ever do this. If you're ever going to write or interact in a sexual or intimate way with somebody, there needs to be consent. You need to ask them if that is okay. You need to make sure that everyone is comfortable with that situation. And if someone expresses that they're uncomfortable, the solution is to back away. It is not to then escalate the situation because somehow you think you understand their sexuality better than they do. With that being said, this is obviously a story that happened a long time ago. They were teenagers, so I'm not expecting that these people need to be told how they should have fixed the situation. I'm sure they knew. But if anyone's watching this and needs to learn anything from this video, I think this situation got as bad as it did because of a failure of communication on everyone's side. While yes, Jane especially needed to communicate consent, there's also some failure on letting it get as bad as it did because I feel like it didn't sound like, anyway, that people spoke up as much as they probably should have during this situation. Starting even back to whenever she first got obsessed with this prince character, it felt like everyone was silently frustrated and wondering why she couldn't read that. And in my personal opinion, I always go through life is that you cannot get mad at somebody for not picking up on your social cues if you do not directly say words. Not everyone is going to read your social signs the same way. Not everyone's going to be able to just pick up on that stuff. If they're not reading your subtle cues, maybe you're being too subtle, and maybe you need to just stop and tell them. it sounds like it doesn't even sound like in character they were really trying that hard to stop her. It was more just, again, they just followed her around. They just went along with it. That can read to somebody like people saying, yeah, we're totally cool with this. We're totally comfortable with this situation. And if they weren't, they should have spoken up or told her like, hey, we really don't like this. This isn't fun. Can you please stop? And the GM especially should have spoken up in this situation and said, hey, can we please move on? I don't want to, like, this was not supposed to be an important character. Or even if they were so confused as to why she was obsessed, even just stopping to ask, why do you give a shit? You know? Again, they were teenagers. I don't expect them to really know how to handle that situation very well. It was their first time playing this game, but that's just for other people to learn off of. I also think it could have helped maybe if Loverboyxxx over there probably should have had a conversation with his girlfriend a lot longer time ago before it got to this point. You know, maybe expressing the fact that like, hey, this makes me uncomfortable that you're so obsessed over this fictional character. You know, just in general, communication would have helped this a lot. But again, teenagers, teenage romance, this is just for you guys to learn from, not so much the OP here. Now, with that being said, that brings us to the end of our video. Comments help the algorithm, so please leave your thoughts or any other stories you might want me to read in the comments down below. Hit that like and subscribe button, and I hope you will enjoy me on the next 2 installments of these stories by RedHotOwl here. With that, I will see you in the next video, my lords, ladies, and lieges. Zodiac, out.